Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in Luke's 9th chapter. It's going to be between material we've already covered. We did verses 22 through 27. We also did verses 46 all the way till 62. We're going to cover the material in between, but to take it back to the beginning, in the 9th chapter, he commissions the 12. He sends them, he says, carry neither person or script, just go, live on the charity of others, bringing the good news and healing wherever you go, wherever you are. And their activity attracts the attention of Herod, who has this rumor of them because they're going all over the place and casting out demons and all this great stuff. And, the rumor is that he may have been John the Baptist raised from the dead, and he had recently beheaded John the Baptist for his fearless witness of his sin of marrying his brother's wife. And then Elijah was another one of them, and they're eventually going to see Elijah in resurrected form in the material we covered today. And then there's the feeding of the 5,000. This is unique. All four Gospels have their version of this. There's also a feeding of 4,000, not to be confused, but we don't want to dwell too much on that. We want to review the material we already covered in our pre-lesson. So he's alone. He's with the disciples. He's praying. He's also praying in the Transfiguration, as Luke. One of the details that is unique to him and most special is that it was an act of prayer. The Transfiguration came in response to prayer. And then he stops praying, and he's with the disciples, and he asks, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" And they repeat the rumors and the gossip. Some say John the Baptist, Elijah, the same figures we already heard, one of the resurrected. Then he points it personal. He says, "Who do you say that I am?" So he personalizes the question, and Peter, being the spokesman of the 12, answers saying, Messiah of Yahweh. In the other version, it's thou art the son of the living Elohim. But he arrives at the correct confession, so this is a milestone in Peter's walk with the Savior. He has an awareness of his divine origin and identity. And then in verse 22, he says in the material we're going to read of two things in the material. We're going to cover the Transfiguration and then a healing. And then we read at the tail end a prediction of his impending death. And this is the second one in the same chapter. So he says in verse 22, "The Son of Man has to suffer much and to be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and has to be killed and raised the third day." So the words I want to emphasize is has to. This means that he had no choice. He could have resisted, but he didn't. So it was providentially arranged, so he had no choice but to do it, and he did it willingly. It was not a violation of his will, and all this stuff had to happen because that was the plan of our salvation, in order to for him to be killed so that we can paradoxically and realistically gain life through the first fruit of the resurrection. So they were going to kill him, but when you say the killed, it goes in one ear and out the other. So the disciples don't really make the most of this. And then he says, verse 24, "Whoever wants to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall save it." So he gave his life for us. He died willingly for us, even though we were enemies, and he died indiscriminately, whether we are wicked or his atoning blood is sufficient for all humanity, but is only efficient for those who come in faith. But if we value our life on earth above all else, then we will sacrifice what we value most in eternity if we covet this life that we have, if we're not willing to daily die, take up our cross, deny ourselves. That is a daily death, and the path of discipleship is one of sacrifice. So we have to lose our life in order to gain it eternally. And, so that's... We're going to start with verse 28. We're just going to hop right into it. "And it came to be about 8 days after these words, talking with Peter and John and Jacob and James, he went up to the mountain to pray." So this is 8 days after the correct confession. This is when they were at Caesarea Philippi in the other versions, and the mountain at which they prayed. Now, the Mount of Transfiguration is traditionally attributed as Mount Hamor, but it is actually Mount Hermon, Mount Tabor, but is more accurately Mount Hermon, we feel, because there was a military citadel on the former location, but at the latter one it was 9,000 feet tall. It was a mountain. The other one was a hill. It was about 1,800 feet. So, and Peter and John and James. So Peter, he would have been Mark, the Gospel of Mark. All of the synoptics carry this story, but John curiously doesn't write of his experience, even though he was there by the consensus of testimony of his three gospel author predecessors. And it all begins in prayer. So he is a man of prayer, and so too are his disciples. He lives in prayer, and so too are we. And it came to be as he prayed, the appearance of his face changed, and his garments radiant white. So the word changed in the Greek, it's the root word for metamorphosis, and this is what gives us what we call the story of the transfiguration. This is the full radiance of the divine splendor on full, naked, uninhibited display in the for all around. He's just exuding the supernal divine light that he is. He is, in his human form, he is veiled, so he inhabits the flesh, but they see him for who he really is, as he was from the eternity. And it's just this radiant being, and not only is he there, but two figures, significant figures of Jewish history, or Jewish religion, are there as well. And see, two men were talking with him, who were Moses and Elijah. So Moses and Elijah are the preeminent figures of the law and the prophets, respectively. Moses was the lawgiver. He is and remains the standard saint of the Jewish religion, and Elijah is the greatest prophet, greatest spoken prophet by measure of writing prophet. I guess Isaiah would take that honor, but in the Jewish imagination, Elijah was a more legendary figure because of the miracles he performed. He didn't write any words, he didn't codify any books, but he stood before kings and predicted. He had the power of drought in his staff, and he was just this mighty, courageous one, and the return of him was something that was longed for. This was the final prediction of the Old Testament. Malachi, and John the Baptist, Yeshua's predecessor and cousin, somewhat fulfills the role. He comes in the spirit of Elijah, but a lot of people think that he is Elijah reincarnated or resurrected. First off, there's no such thing as reincarnation, and second off, he came in the power and the spirit, so he did pave the way and point the path. He fulfilled Malachi 3:1 and also 4:5 and possibly 6. But the law and prophets are combined, and they are there. So we have the Trinity of Moses, Elijah, and Yeshua, the model saints. And these men were sinners, but they are exalted in resurrected form, and they are there for display. Who, having appeared in the esteem, spoke of his death, which he was about to complete at Jerusalem. So what did they say? They repeat what he said earlier, that he is going to die, and this is necessary. This is part of the path and the plan of salvation. In order for it to be perfected, he has to bleed on the cross with the nails in his hand, flesh as one of us, and die the exquisite pain and agony and the suffering of it. So this was all foretold in the prophecies. And even though, Moses wrote the first 5 books, and Moses, I could have said more on him. He is the standard. His law informed all the prophets. Any prophetic utterance which deviated from the Mosaic covenant was tantamount to heresy. So there's a reason that none of the written recorded prophecies in the Old Testament deviate from what Moses outlined in the Torah, and that's because they were covenant enforcers. So his supremacy is established in chapters such as Numbers 12 and also Deuteronomy 34:10. Never been anyone like him, with the exception of the one who he pointed to in Deuteronomy 18:15, the one who said, when he comes among you, listen to him, lest you be destroyed. And they were eternally for their lack of reception. But Peter and those with him were heavy with sleep, and having awakened, they saw his esteem and the 2 men standing with them. So this it's awesome to wake up to, if you have some momentum. But if you just wake up to this, or if you're fighting back sleep, if you're holding back your eyelids, if you're on the door of dozing out, something like this will grab your attention and keep you awake. So this is a once in an eternity spectacle that they are beholding right now. This is the full manifestation of his divine splendor whilst in human form, the one and only occasion. And they see, Moses and Elijah, and what would we say in such a situation? And we'd probably be speechless, honestly, but Peter does have a word on his tongue. That's just the way he was. And it came to be, as they were parting from him, Peter said to Joshua, Master, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 booths, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. So not knowing what he said, Peter has an annoying habit of blurting out loud without calculating his words. He's a man who's inclined to speak before he thinks about what he says. This is just the impulsive nature of the disciple who walked with him in the flesh. And he is courageous, but he is careless. He is overconfident, and so he misses a lot. But he is, for all his faults, a very loyal lieutenant and certainly a moral model. But he says the wrong thing. He wants to keep them there forever, so he's so transfixed on this sight and spectacle of the 2 revered figures of the Jewish religion in his sight, in their full radiance, resurrected and with him and around him, that he wants to prolong the occasion. He's just speaking out of his head. He doesn't know what he's saying. And as he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. So while he was saying this, be careful what you wish for, because then suddenly a cloud comes and overwhelms them, overshadows them. They are surrounded by the supernal radiance, to be suddenly overcome by a cloud of darkness, and they are trembling in fear. The they is the disciples. As they enter into the cloud more accurately entered into them. This cloud must have consumed all the territory around it. So it's not so much they entered into it as that it overshadowed and overwhelmed them. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, the beloved, hear him. So this mimics the baptismal waters where we witness the Trinity in tandem, where the Spirit descends on him in the form of the dove, but the voice is identical, and it is the Father's. He speaks in a voice that is likened to thunder implicitly, so it comes out of the cloud. It's powerful, it's unmistakable, and what does he say when he speaks to the present audience? He says, Listen to my son, this is him. Hear him, because his words are my own, his thoughts are my own, his heart is my own, and his essence is my own. And when the voice had spoken, Joshua was found alone, and they were silent and reported to no one in those days of what they had seen. So after the voice of divinity had spoken and said and was done with, Joshua retreated. He was alone. He sought solitude to get away from the hecticness of it all. But they were in stunned silence. The they once more, and the they were silence were once more the disciples, and they saved the occasion with which they transcribed. So Mark recorded the transfiguration in the 8th chapter of his book, and he was basically Peter's second-hand account. And then Matthew and Luke. Luke must have been a historian who interviewed at least, probably all of the ones who were there. Yeah, well, they were still living, and that's just his method, his historical method. He's a diligent historian. But now we read on to something new. So the evangelical inertia is self-imposed. Oftentimes we witness the master saying, go tell everyone in the village, or he heals someone and tells them, tell no man, because he doesn't want to attract attention. So it's all part of the plan of providence. In verse 36 we read of a different scene, and this is, so Luke's transfiguration account is probably the shortest one. I think that's only 6 verses, but we're going to take it from here. We've covered other versions of these in single lessons, but here we are. And then the voice was and it came to pass on the next day, when they came down from the mountain, that a large crowd met him. So from the intimate company of 4 human witnesses and 2 resurrected beings and a divine voice, the cast of characters suddenly changed to just a multitude, a mass of ordinary people. there for different reasons and different states of sincerity and spiritual purity, but they are there nonetheless, and they want to meet this miracle man, and of course there's someone in need, so he goes to the front and center, and he gets what he wants, as we read. And see, a man from the crowd cried out, saying, Teacher, I beg you, look at my son, for he is my only child. So when people had sick people, if you were sick, blind, you tried to get your way to this man from Nazareth who had the healing. So this man brought his child with him, to his only child, because he heard that this miracle man from Nazareth would be in the village, and so he approached him with his child in hand, and this his child was demon possessed, as we read. Symptoms of demon possession include, but are not limited to, the loss of sanity and self-control. So he was prone to compulsive seizures, as we read in the next verse. And see, a spirit seized him, and he suddenly cries out, and it convulses him with foaming, and scarcely leaves him, bruising him. So this demon in him reduces him. It's a loud noise, and it causes him, so it's not really him, but it's the demon in him speaking through him, convulsing him and turning him into a drooling vegetable and inflicting injury on itself, because he has no modicum of self-control. He's just, prone to seizures, shaking all the time, and he's just this state of abject degradation that he is in until he is liberated from the demon. So that's what demons do. Demons oppress and enslave people. And if you don't resist the oppression, you will be enslaved. So when we become born again, I don't think a born again believer can be demon possessed, but the demons will attack you. It's just part of the path. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they were unable. So that was the wrong answer from them. So the other disciples are the 9. The other 12 who weren't privy to this exalted witness on the top of this mountain, which Mount Haber, not, we said it earlier. But while the master was gone, they were impotent to accommodate this healing, and earlier they were given authority to heal sicknesses in the sending off of the 12, healing everyone, healing everywhere, verse 6. So these disciples are unable to perform an exorcism where their services are needed. And Yahshua answering said, O generation, unbelieving and corrupted, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here. So he sees in his disciples, he's just sees a microcosm of the entire generation that he has to contend with, the generation that's going to kill him, and he's just begging them to get it over with, because if this disciple, if these 12, these 9 men have so little faith, because faith is the instrument which will unlock the healing potential, at least for the apostles. The healing ministry is not necessarily our own in the present world. But their generation had a poor report card, and he's just going to do it in spite of them. And he was still coming, and as he was still coming, the demon threw him down in convulsions, and Yahweh rebuked the unclean spirit, and healed the child, and gave him back to his father. So while his son, the demon, is aware of the presence, the spiritually superior presence of the Son of Elohim, they convulse at his sight. So this demon is mentally deranged, and that's why it's convulsing all the time, and it lashes out into a vicious spasm and throws him down in convulsion. But Yahshua rebukes it with a word. All he has to say is, be gone, and it is gone. And sometimes they beg him not to send them to hell, but, they understand that the power is in his hands. And he heals them, and he gives them back brand new to the Father. So his Father got what he bargained for. He, doesn't apologize for his disciples. He just says, what's with the people I have to put up with. And they were all amazed at the greatness of Elohim. And while all were marveling at all Yahshua did, he said to his disciples, Lay up in your ears these words, for the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. So from the mountain to the valley, so we're witnessing a mountaintop experience on Mount Tabor, where the Mount Transfiguration, then they're in the valley, and then they're in the mountain of being amazed, and then they have the sudden awareness of the valley of his death. So even though at this glorious moment in time he is universally acclaimed, he is universally beloved, everyone's amazed at him, and they recognize the greatness of Elohim works through his hands, and perhaps that he is Elohim himself. And he tells this to his disciples, enjoy it while it lasts, because it's not going to last forever. We are en route. We are marching to Jerusalem, to my permanent death and your eternal salvation through that death. But he was about to be, so they were en route as we speak, I believe. They were headed that way. But they did not understand this saying, and it was veiled from them, so that they did not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. So they were confused and they were fearful. They did not want to rectify the confusion. They thought they heard it, but maybe they didn't want to think it was true. So they did this cognitive dissonance to tell them it couldn't be so. This man's not going to die. This man we forsook our fishnets for and cast away our tax collectors' table for, in Matthew's case. But their minds, for whatever reason, and there could be a million and one ways, and it's ultimately speculative, and I don't have the answers, and that's one of the things that we have to accept by living by faith. It doesn't have all the answers, but all we need to know is that they didn't understand it, so they missed it for whatever reason. Something like that does stand out to us, but we got to be charitable and put ourselves in their shoes, and if you're afraid to ask, you will never know the answer to their question. And they had to find out the hard way that he meant what he said. So everything he said did come true. There was to be a cross in his life, there was to be a cross in their lives, and there should be a cross in our lives. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.